There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?"
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
The Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. And now your host, Stephen Hanks.
You know, folks, every Saturday morning when I'm driving from my home in the village of Oak Creek, which at 7 a.m. is only about a 20-minute drive to this radio station in West Sedona, Arizona, I think about what soundbite from a speech I heard during the previous week that I could tack onto my opening of iconic speeches from legendary Democratic progressives like the ones you just heard. Of course, if I wanted to be consistent, I'd have my wonderful producer, Ryan Thompson, add a quote that was uplifting and inspirational. And so I could pick many from Kamala Harris's presidential campaign speeches to add to those comments. But if the point I wanted to make at the start of this show was to expose the contrast between some of our great Democratic Party leaders and what constitutes leadership on the other side of the political spectrum right now, all I would need to do is tack on an audio that was this quote. Donald Trump said of his supporters who came to Washington on January 6th recently at a town hall, quote, "They didn't come because of me. They came because of the election. They thought the election was a rigged election, and that's why they came. They went down to the Capitol. I said peacefully and patriotically. Nothing done wrong at all. Nothing done wrong. And action was taken, strong action. Ashley Babbitt was killed. Nobody was killed. There were no guns down there. We didn't have guns. The others had guns, but we didn't have guns. And when I say we, these are people that walked down. This was a tiny percentage of the overall, which nobody sees and nobody shows. But that was a day of love from the standpoint of the millions. It's like hundreds of thousands. It could have been the largest group I've ever spoken to before. They asked me to speak. I went and I spoke. And I used the term peacefully and patriotically." Unquote. So according to a man who again wants to be the president of the United States of America, the ransacking of the capital of this country and the killing of police officers and the threats to kill a vice president and members of Congress was, quote, "a day of love," unquote. To all of you out there listening to me right now, I am hoping and wishing and even praying with every fiber of my being, especially since I may become a grandfather for the first time come this spring, that Donald Trump not only doesn't find himself in the Oval Office ever again, but finds himself inside a jail cell come 2025. And I guess saying that now makes me one of the enemies from within. And on that cheerful note, good morning to all of you out there in Sedona and throughout the Verde Valley listening to me right now on this October 19th, 2024, through KAZM 106.5 FM and 780 AM Mellow Mountain Radio. Like the announcer said, my name is Stephen Hanks, and this radio show, which is heard every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, is called the Patriotic Progressive for Truth, Justice, and the Democratic Way. And I also want to welcome folks from all over Arizona and around the country who may be tuning into the live stream on mellowmountainradio.com, and anyone who is listening to the podcast version on Apple or Amazon Podcasts, my YouTube channel, Spotify, and now you can also listen to the podcast on my Substack newsletter at Patriotic Progressive. That's at Patriotic Progressive on Substack. And I have a sponsor this week and next week, and that sponsor of the Patriotic Progressive is Aubrey Sonderegger, Democratic candidate for Coconino County, Arizona recorder. And that's an extremely important position in this area of Arizona, as the recorder oversees how elections are run in the county, part of which includes Sedona. If you heard our show a couple of weeks back, in fact, Aubrey was one of my special guests telling us why Coconino County voters should be voting for her now or on Election Day. And that actually provides me with a natural segue into my segment before I introduce this morning's very special guest. You know, with early voting going on right now throughout Arizona, I not only want to urge everyone in my listening audience to vote, and that's including my podcast audience, wherever you may be, but I want to offer my endorsements for candidates in the most important races and one major Arizona statewide ballot proposition. Now, naturally, you should vote for Democrats up and down the ticket, whether national, statewide, or local. And by the way, here are a couple of very important Arizona election deadlines. Friday, October 25th is the last day to request an early ballot, and Tuesday, October 29th, is the deadline to mail back that early ballot. So please be on top of those dates. So let's go on with the endorsements. I'm really jazzed about giving you my picks for this election. On the federal level, of course, all Democrats, and I hope a fair amount of Republicans and independents who aren't in the Trump cult, will vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz for president and vice president. There is also a Senate election this year for the open Arizona seat in Washington, and Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego should and will, that's my prediction, win against the totally toxic election-denying troll Kari Lake. The folks in this area of Arizona in Congressional District 2 should without question vote for Democrat and Native American candidate Jonathan Nez over Trump sycophant Eli Crane. Folks, we just can't have Eli Crane representing this district of Arizona until the next census in 2030, when perhaps a redistricting committee might redo the map, which is why Eli Crane got elected to that district in the first place. So come on, let's vote for Jonathan Nez and make Eli Crane a one-term congressman. For the state legislature in District 1, which includes most of Yavapai County and a sliver of Coconino County, you should vote for Mike Fogel for state senator against another insurrectionist supporter and election-denying Trump loon Mark Fincham. And now for state representative in District 1. You have 2 votes you can cast, and you should vote for both Jay Ruby and Marcia Smith. Now, last week on the Patriotic Progressive, we replayed our interviews with Yelenia Aguilar, Jonathan Hill, and Joshua Polachek, the 3 Democratic candidates running to be on the Arizona Corporation Commission. And you must vote for them if you don't want Republicans beholden to special interests in Arizona running that commission. You may not know a lot about it, but you should research it. It's extremely important jobs in this state. For Yavapai County District 3 Supervisor, you should vote for Democrat Nikki Check, who has been a guest on both my KAZM Mellow Mountain Radio shows and is a terrific candidate. And in Coconino County, you should cast your vote for Adam Hess as Supervisor for District 3 and the aforementioned sponsor of today's show, Aubrey Sonderegger, for County Recorder. Now, there are 13 statewide propositions on the ballot this election, and of course, the big kahuna is Proposition 139, which would establish a state constitutional right to abortion. You must vote yes for reproductive freedom for women. Now, I'm not going to do a suggestion on all the other propositions because I'd never be able to get my guest in here. But for more information on all the ballot propositions, both statewide and in Yavapai and Coconino County, please go to www.democratsoftheredrocks.org. That's www.democratsoftheredrocks.org, an organization to which I am a proud member, and they have a lot of great information and advice for Democrats on the website. All right, now to my very special guest via phone this morning from his home in Orangevale, California, a suburb of Sacramento, is Mark McKibbin. I think McKinnon is one of the pundits on MSNBC, but this is Mark McKibbin. He's an author, political commentator, and political consultant with a growing following on the social media platform Threads, where I discovered him through, and his recent article called Strange Political Bedfellows about the origins of the Electoral College. Mark also authors a Substack newsletter called The Thornfield Quill, where with his friend and co-author Jack Benjamin, he publishes analysis, opinions, and essays about policy, politics, culture, and media. Mark received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Communications from the George Washington University in 2020 and his Master of Philosophy in Comparative Social Policy from the University of Oxford in 2022. How impressive is that? Mark wrote his master's thesis on how the COVID-19 pandemic influenced the political advocacy strategies of the medical industries in the U.S. and Canada. He has worked on political campaigns and in government offices at the local, state, and national levels. And if all that wasn't enough, folks, my guest is celebrating his 27th birthday today. Yes, I said that right. 27. Happy birthday, Mark, and welcome to the Patriotic Progressive.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Stephen. It's wonderful to be here.
It's great having you. I've been so impressed. I actually get a big kick, and I've been wanting to recruit guests onto the show who I think are doing great work on platforms like Threads and Substack, and you're the first one I've been able to have on the show, so I'm really pleased that you were able to do this. And one of the things that caught my eye on your Threads bio, before we get into the heavy stuff, is that you call yourself a pragmatic progressive, which I actually almost called myself for the title of the show before I landed on patriotic, just to tick off the right wing. So I'm curious to hear about how you define being a pragmatic progressive, because I got pushback on combining patriotic with progressive from, Trumpers who would say, oh, it's a contradiction. You can't be patriotic and a progressive. So give me your definition of how you see yourself as a pragmatic progressive.
Well, I think the way I define pragmatic progressive, it was a label I defined being in California, where pretty much everyone in California that has political power is a Democrat. And so being a Democrat isn't particularly helpful in terms of understanding what people believe and where people are going to stand on issues. But and sometimes people define themselves as progressive ideologically and in the candidates they endorse. But when it actually comes to where they stand on the issues, they're not what I would define as pragmatic about those issues. Mm-hmm. I think, a good example of this is housing in California, where sometimes you get people who are known as progressives, but when you look at their housing policies or the housing policies they've supported, they end up supporting policies that have actually made it harder to build housing in California and have made our homelessness crisis worse. So at a very 10,000-foot view, I think pragmatic progressives are the people who are progressive operationally and not just ideologically.
Well, that's a great way to put it. I also, being a writer and editor who loves alliteration, I also wanted to call myself a passionate, practical, patriotic progressive, but that would be too long a title for all the social media that I had to do for the show. So I've been very depressed for almost a quarter of a century since the morning I found out the Supreme Court decided in favor of George W. Bush as the winner of the 2000 election over Al Gore when you were a mere toddler. And I won't even get into what my state of mind has been since November 2016. So I want to ask you, can I blame the men in Congress in the late 18th century for my depression because of the Electoral College they created?
Yes, is the short answer.
And so, when I attended primary and secondary school in New York in the 1960s and early 70s, when they actually taught civics and American history, I was led to believe that the Electoral College was this grand creation out of compromise and the basic belief that the Founding Fathers didn't want to have a tyranny of the majority and that a few very populous states wouldn't have the power to determine the president. But that obviously was one of those patriotic fairy tales we are taught about how this country really came to be. The most recent analysis of many historians, not only about the Electoral College, but also about the creation of the filibuster, was that it was a way to placate the southern slave states. So, the floor is yours. Give us your take on this, as you outlined in your terrific recent piece about the origins of the Electoral College.
So I think the first thing that I want to address is the concept of the tyranny of the majority, because we hear this phrase thrown around quite often. And I think the quote I'm going to invoke, or the person I'm going to invoke, is someone who I'm actually working on a book manuscript on, and his name is Founding Father James Wilson. And they were having this debate about people versus states at the Constitutional Convention. And he said, who are we making a government for? People or these imaginary beings called states? And ultimately, in his view, the government and the government the founders were trying to create through the Constitution, or at least the government that he wanted to create, it was about people. And states are very, very helpful. They were helpful as laboratories of democracy. They were helpful for addressing certain issues that were better addressed by states than the federal government. But this idea that states matter more than people was just something that he did not believe. And frankly, I don't believe either. So that's number one. And I think that number two, in terms of the Electoral College and the origins of the Electoral College, it's important to understand that the Electoral College was not some wonderful creation that was thought through months of deliberative processes where people very carefully designed it. It was a very messy process, and it's been described as an 11th hour addition to the Constitution. And it was the product of debate. It was the product of appeasing of slaveholding interests. And as I make the point in my article, slaveholding interests wasn't just the South. It was also Northern delegates, and particularly New England delegates, whose states profited from the slave trade and arguably were economically dependent on the continued existence of the slave trade. So we need to understand that and stop treating whether the Electoral College or other provisions of the Constitution as if it's this kind of collector's item whose value will be diminished when handled. James Wilson, when he was giving his speech on the ratification of the Constitution, practically begged future generations to fix the Constitution in ways that worked for them and said, this is not a perfect thing. So when I hear people treating the constitutions or the founders with this untouchable reverence, it's just so ahistorical. And quite frankly, it makes me want to rip my hair out.
Yeah, I'm in definitely the same camp. I want to, talk to you a little bit about a recent effort that almost happened to get rid of the Electoral College. There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago called Kill Switch by Adam Gentleson, who was a former top aide to Senator Harry Reid of Nevada. It was about the rise of the modern Senate, and most of the book focused on the filibuster, but there was also a section in the book where Adam talked about Senator Birch Bayh's effort in the early 70s, I guess it was 69, 70, to get rid of the Electoral College, which the majority of Americans agreed with at the time and still do. And Birch Bayh actually got through the Judiciary Committee by a pretty good vote, a vote to eliminate the Electoral College. But, the Southern senators, led by Strom Thurmond, who was probably the most right-wing racist senator in the Congress at the time, were able to convince some Democratic senators, for whatever reason, that it wouldn't be a good idea to get rid of the Electoral College. How much do you know about that, and can you speak to any of that effort?
Well, some fun trivia about the Bayh family was that my dad my dad was born in Kendallville, Indiana, and he actually knew the Bayh family.
Oh, wow.
And if I remember correctly, this is off the top of my head, so I would have to fact check this with him, but he actually babysat Evan Bayh, Birch Bayh's son, who eventually became a U.S. Senator for the state of Indiana. So that's just a fun story just to start us off. And yeah, I'm very aware of Birch Bayh's efforts. I believe Birch Bayh, if I remember correctly, he was also responsible for the constitutional. He was very helpful to the constitutional amendment that lowered the age limit for voting. Mm-hmm. So there was a variety of things that he tried to do to make the Constitution more pluralistic, is the best way I would characterize it. And I think that's exactly that kind of philosophy that the Constitution needs to expand and be more inclusive and more pluralistic, is exactly the kind of mindset that will move our country forward, and frankly is not shared by all members of Congress, unfortunately, who tend to think that change is a bad thing or change will somehow disrupt the American experiment. And that's just not true. Change is a good thing. Change helps democracy survive, and it helps democracy deliver.
Let me ask you to play a little devil's advocate, just so our listeners can hear what the arguments legitimate arguments if they're on the other side in keeping the Electoral College. And the devil's advocate position would be, and you've probably heard this as I have, that, well, if you made it a popular vote, then the presidential candidates, all they'd be doing is campaigning in the most populous states. They'd never be in South Dakota. They'd never be in Maine. They would just be in California, New York, and Texas, and all the huge states. What is that an argument, a legitimate argument? And what if you had an argument to not get rid of it? What would it be?
Well, I think I've seen a lot of geographical arguments for the Electoral College from people from states who say, well, we are going to be forgotten about if the Electoral College is eliminated. And so there are arguments like this where I feel if you just make that argument and you don't contextualize it, it sounds reasonable. It's kind of like when J.D. Vance says things like we need to make it easier to have kids. If you take that out of context, and you might say, okay, that sounds reasonable, but then you start to get a little deeper, and then you realize the flawed logic in the argument and the shaky premises on which the argument is built. Mm-hmm. So in the sense of the Electoral College, I think the idea that presidential candidates won't visit less populous states anymore is, I would counter that by saying, well, they're still going to go campaign with Senate candidates in those states. There's still gubernatorial races in those states, and they want to build a bench of Democrats in those states because you know what? If they elect a governor of their party, then they have a prime candidate for Senate in the future. So I don't really understand the argument that, well, presidential candidates won't visit your state if we don't have the Electoral College. So that's number one. Number two is I think the idea that I wish Americans would define themselves less exactly by which state they come from, because the reality is that the issues that people have across states matter much or are much more similar than people often think. Mm-hmm. Like I think I come from California, and everyone thinks of California as big cities like Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a very, very important part of California. But I live in a suburb in Orangevale. And Orangevale is not a Democratic community. It's quite a Republican community. And so I grew up with a lot of Republicans, and I still work with a lot of Republicans in local politics. And so that's really important. And I find it extremely hypocritical for anyone claiming that people from California don't care about flyover country, quote unquote, to also call everyone from California coastal elites, because a lot of us don't live on the coast. A lot of us do live from suburban and rural areas. And I think that's really, really important to understand.
Mm. So let's play a little hypothetical on the future of the Electoral College. Let's say Kamala Harris is elected, and which we all hope she is, as president. And the Democrats, I think the Democrats are going to retake the House. I don't know by how many seats. I think there's going to be a blue wave in the House like there was in 2018. And I'm very hopeful that they maintain the Senate, the edge in the Senate, even if it's only by 1 or 2 votes. So let's assume all 3 of those things happen. What are the chances of getting rid of the Electoral College happening in I don't know, the next 4 to 8 years? Do you see it?
Well, I think, there's a couple paths to eliminating the Electoral College. Number one is through a constitutional amendment, which, as specified by Article 5, requires a 2/3 majority of Congress and then a 3/4 majority of states.
States, right?
And that would probably be most likely state legislatures. You can technically do a constitutional conventions in the states, but I believe that's only happened once, and it's for the 25th Amendment, which was famously to repeal the 18th Amendment on prohibition. So I think so. That's option one, but there's generally agreement, I think, and this is pretty universal, that's just not very likely to happen. So then there's the second option that a lot of people float, which is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what that basically does, is my understanding of it, is that the states who have agreed to it agree to give the electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, regardless of who wins the Electoral College votes in their state. And the idea is that if you get states to do that, enough states to do that, totaling 270 electoral votes, you will have gone to a national popular vote without having to go through the cumbersome process of a constitutional amendment. Now, I also want to say that this is something that people should be aware of, and this is something that a lot of constitutional scholars have written about. Most famously, Akil Reed Amar has written about this, is the idea that we are not, as Americans, limited to Article 5 in terms of amending the Constitution. We have to remember that in 1787, until the Constitution was, when the Constitutional Convention was happening, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation that basically said any changes have to be consented to but by every single state. So it had to get unanimous consent. And you had measures that got 11 or 13 states that were literally torpedoed because one state wouldn't consent, which is one of the reasons why the Constitution was necessary. But the Constitution wasn't established through a mechanism specified in the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, it was we, the people, who said, we want a new form of government. So if that was how the Constitution was invented, the argument has been made that I agree with, that you could amend the Constitution outside of Article 5. Now, exactly how that would work, I won't get too weedsy on that.
Right.
But I think, so when we talk about the Interstate Compact and giving that the force of, even if it has the force of law at the state level, there's a possibility of turning that into being constitutional through a mechanism outside of Article 5. So I'll just float that as something for your listeners to think on and understand in terms of changing and amending the Constitution.
Yeah. Thanks for that info. That was really interesting, and it wasn't too weedsy for my audience, I hope. But so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your James Wilson project, because I'm very intrigued by that for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk to you about. But I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, and then we'll be back with our discussion with Mark McKibbin. So as I mentioned earlier, my sponsor for today's show is Aubrey Sonderegger, the Democratic candidate for Coconino County Recorder. Aubrey grew up in the Southwest and has been a resident of Flagstaff since 2011. She is a committed mom and outdoor enthusiast whose political activism began in 2016. Aubrey has worked to defend voting rights and elect people into government that will uphold the ideals of democracy and civil rights for every citizen. She has held various elected positions in the Coconino County Democratic Party, through which she promoted civic engagement from the very diverse demographics of Coconino County. If you, my listeners, want to continue the legacy of free and fair election services in Coconino County, Arizona, you must vote for Aubrey Sonderegger for Recorder. And I'm sure Aubrey Sonderegger approves of that message, or she wouldn't be sponsoring the show. So, Mark, this may be a little frivolous, but let's see if you can go with me on it. I know you're working on this biography of James Wilson, of the founding father who helped invent the American presidency and was the only person in history to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and serve as a Supreme Court justice. And he was also very involved in the debate over what we have been discussing here, the Electoral College. But my first exposure to James Wilson, maybe I shouldn't admit this, and it's because I'm a big musical theater fan, was through the musical and the film 1776. And I don't know if you've seen the movie, and I would assume that you have as a political junkie.
I have.
Okay. So James Wilson is portrayed in that film and that musical, and he's one of the three delegates on the Pennsylvania delegation, along with John Dickinson and, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And James Wilson is portrayed in that story as a bumbling fool who's a sycophant who only votes the way John Dickinson tells him to vote. What's the deal with that? Why is James Wilson, was that just a conceit of the writers? Why would they have done that to a guy who was pretty substantial?
Well, I think with any fictional portrayal, you're going to have an artist taking creative liberties for the sake of their narrative. So that's number one. But, and someone I want to, shout out here is William Ewald, who has done tremendous work on James Wilson and who's been extremely helpful to me in my research. And he takes a great issue with this portrayal of James Wilson in 1776. And and he speaks about it quite extensively. So if people really want to get an in-depth criticism of that, I would refer you to his work. But just generally, I would say that I think James Wilson at the time, he was kind of an obscure figure. And I doubt Peter Stone, who wrote 1776, did much research into James Wilson. He used him to tell the story he wanted to tell. And I think ultimately, and that's unfortunately been the case with James Wilson often, is that people, and people don't really understand him. They don't, and if they did make an effort to understand him, they would think about him much, much differently. And so and they would think about American history much, much differently. So that portrayal is inaccurate. For the most part, he was not a coward. He was actually, crucial to independence, and he was working furiously. If you look at the records of the Second Continental Congress, to get the votes for independence, because basically what you had was the delegates to the Pennsylvania's delegate to the Second Continental Congress were chosen by the Pennsylvania Assembly. And the Pennsylvania Assembly had basically given them strict orders, do not vote for independence. And so James Wilson was working behind the scenes to try to get them to release the Assembly, to release the delegates from that commitment, which they eventually did. And then he ended up getting a bunch of other delegates, including Thomas Jefferson and people like that, to sign a defense of Wilson, saying he is interested in independence and he is pursuing independence. And then eventually you get to, so you go through all of that, and then you get to July 1st, where they take a vote, and Pennsylvania votes 3-4 against independence. And so then there's some backroom dealing that night, and then you come back on July 2, and then Pennsylvania votes 3-2 for independence. Now, notice I said 3-2 on July 2, 3-4 on July 1. What happened? Robert Morris and John Dickinson, two close friends of James Wilson, don't take their seats. And that was what did it and allowed independence to happen, and it allowed a unanimous vote of the states or I should say the colonies at the time, on independence. And there's no definitive proof of why Morris and Dickinson did not take their seats. But given that James Wilson was Dickinson's legal apprentice, and he was very good friends with Robert Morris, I don't think it's wild to infer that James Wilson was one of, if not the primary person who persuaded them to not take their seats and allow Pennsylvania's supporters of independence to carry the vote. So that's the real history, and I think that history needs to be told so that people know that James Wilson was basically the deciding vote on independence. The other thing I'll mention is that the preamble to the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote was likely inspired by a document James Wilson wrote in 1774. It was a long title, but it was basically Considerations on the Authority of the British Parliament was the abbreviated title, where James Wilson says, all men are by nature free and equal. And we know Jefferson read that pamphlet. We also know that James Wilson, throughout the 18th century, was the only person who really quoted the Declaration of Independence's preamble in any substantial capacity. And that's also true in the 19th century, up until Abraham Lincoln. So James Wilson was a very, very important person in the independence movement. He was reluctant to embrace independence at first, but when it mattered, he was there. And I think that's the real history that people need to know, that is very different from the history that Peter Stone tells in 1776.
Yeah, those are great points. And one thing that kind of surprises me, and it's not a major point, but so the Pennsylvania delegation was actually larger than the three people depicted in the film for the Constitutional for the Congress.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay.
It was much larger than that.
Yeah, I'm also surprised to hear that the Pennsylvania legislature thought that they could totally shackle Benjamin Franklin in terms of, how he was going to vote on this. But anyway, one other thing I want to mention about 1776, because it ties into your point about how a northern state like Massachusetts was complicit in the Electoral College debate, siding with the southern states. And I'm sure you'll remember this, and that's the scene where the delegate at South Carolina sings the song "Molasses to Rum to Slaves," which basically is their accusation that in spite of John Adams being adamant about an anti-slavery provision in the Declaration of Independence, that Massachusetts actually was helping to enable slavery. And I think it would be shocking to a lot of people, given the whole history up to the Civil War, that northern states like Massachusetts were kind of totally on board with slavery at the time.
Well, and I think one of the things, there's the academic facts, and a lot of those you just stated and I talked about in my article, but I think if I had a message that I want people to understand when we talk about slavery, was that it was a system that implicated everybody in the 18th century, including the people who were anti-slavery, And so the goal, I think the objective of that...
Mark, you're fading... excuse me, Mark.
It's not about...
Yeah, Mark, you're fading out a little bit at the beginning of sentences, so I don't know if you're moving away from the mic or...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Just let me know if the sound is okay. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
So I guess... So the goal of... If there's a message I want people to take away, it's that when it comes to slavery and how institutionalized slavery was, everyone was implicated. And so it's important that we don't just point fingers at the South, even though slavery was a huge part of the South. It's that even the people you may admire among the founders were complicit in one way or another with the slaveholding system. And unfortunately, we still see slaveholding institutions in American society today through the prison labor system. Literally, I was filling out my ballot in the California election last night, and I was voting on a proposition that would eliminate involuntary servitude language in the California Constitution. So I was literally voting on slavery on my California ballot.
Wow.
And this is 2024. And I think that's really, really important. Now, California is not a state that people associate with slavery, but it's important for us to understand that, you know, it's not just about pointing fingers at other people. It's about reflecting on ways that we may be, or states that we live in may be complicit or associated with unjust institutions. And so I think that was the message. That's the message that I want people to take away when we talk about the Electoral College and slavery and the strange political bedfellows that brought the Electoral College to fruition as an appeasement of slaveholding interests. Yeah.
Just real quick, you know, a lot of people sort of connect the Electoral College debate with debate over getting rid of the filibuster. Do you think that it's going to be easier to get rid of the filibuster because it doesn't take a constitutional amendment to do it? What's your take on whether or not we can see the filibuster go, and should we?
So the answer to should we is yes, absolutely. I think that a stat that I want to cite for you, and listeners can check my math on this, but I'm using census data, is that in 2009, when Democrats had a 60-vote majority, based on my calculations, Democratic senators represented approximately 62% of Americans. In 2020, Democrats won 50 seats, and they were representing approximately 56% of Americans. And hypothetically, let's say that Democrats had won the 10 seats where Republicans won by the closest margins in the Senate, and they had 60 seats, they would have represented 66% of Americans. So the filibuster has become more minoritarian over time. You have a gradually lower proportion of the population being able to block legislation in terms of which senators represent who. So it's become more minoritarian over time, and it's blocking very, very important legislation. And as the filibuster is, we can't restore Roe, we can't reform the Supreme Court, we can't pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we can't do so many of the things we want to do. Now, so yes, we should eliminate the filibuster.
And when you put it that way, it just tells you. I mean, the flip side of what you just said, though we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do the other thing, is that the Republican right wing will prevent all of it, and that just tells you everything you need to know about that side of the scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about your thread on Threads this past Monday, which was a thread about your thoughts on J.D. Vance's interview with the New York Times. Now, when I read it, I immediately commented, "Fantastic thread, Mark." That's basically all I said. And I want you to know that simple reply apparently got me over 10,000 views, while about 150 followers loved the comment. You wrote that the thread had become your all-time most viewed, liked, and reposted Threads post since you joined the platform. And just to let my audience know, the thread was regarding J.D. Vance's views on parenting, abortion, and immigration in an interview that he gave with the New York Times. Now, you wrote almost 1,200 words in that thread, but I'd like my audience to hear your last two paragraphs, which I think sum it all up very well. So I'm going to quote you right now. This is what Mark wrote. Quote, "Let's be very clear. Contrary to what J.D. Vance says, immigration is not what is fraying social trust in this country. Rather, what is fraying social trust in the United States is Congress and the federal government continually abdicating its responsibility to check," and this is the part I love, "corporate greed and stop the exploitation of workers, consumers, and families, all of which Republicans actually want to encourage even more. Do not be fooled by J.D. Vance's oh shucks routine or his heartfelt stories about growing up in the heartland. Whatever kind of compassionate streak J.D. Vance may have had in his past, he has clearly abandoned it to bend the knee at the altar of Donald Trump, MAGA, and the extremists behind Project 2025. J.D. Vance is out for himself and does not care how many people he hurts and subjugates in the process. He is unfit for any elected office, let alone the vice presidency." Comments that I wholeheartedly agree with. So, Mark, here's a left-wing conspiracy theory for you. Do you think that if, God forbid, Donald Trump is elected, the right-wing think tanks running his campaign will get him out of office with the 25th Amendment so J.D. Vance can be their president?
Well, I don't know. Is the first, I far be it from me to speculate about what's going in the minds of of people who have shown no limits to their moral bankruptcy, quite frankly. So I'll just say that, number one. I am a little bit skeptical. I've seen this theory floated, and my thinking, I'm a little bit skeptical of that because I don't actually think they would need to remove Donald Trump at all to do all the horrible things that they want to do.
They could just send them out. They could just send them out. They could just send them out to the golf course every day and do everything behind the scenes.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah. I mean, look, I think we'll see. Hopefully we won't see. We're working very hard so we won't see this, but I don't think Donald Trump. Donald Trump's not some passionate policy mind, right? We know this about him. Okay, he's running for re-election to punish his quote unquote the enemy within,
right?
And stay out of prison. Like that's why he's running for president. But what he will do is he will hand over the reins of power to people who he sees as his most faithful lieutenants, like Stephen Miller.
Yeah, that was the first name that came to my mind too.
Right, and I think the thing that it's important for people to remember about Stephen Miller is that Stephen Miller was on Donald Trump's campaign back in 2015 when no one thought he had a chance, when everyone else said Donald Trump he's just doing this for ratings, whatever. And Stephen Miller was enthusiastically speaking for Donald Trump at these rallies. This Stephen Miller is an able person, and he is someone who is highly regarded by Donald Trump because he truly was a day one Donald Trump supporter.
Well, I think Stephen Miller is his number one speechwriter. You don't really hear about who writes his speeches, but when Donald Trump makes a speech where he starts going after his enemies, it sounds like Stephen Miller through and through.
Yeah, it was. And I think the thing that's important to remember about Stephen Miller is that when Donald Trump was president, there was a deal that was in the works on immigration where it was, some kind of pathway to citizenship in exchange for the border wall. And Stephen Miller was the one who foiled the deal through putting all of these new restrictions related to new immigrant arrivals. And there were a lot of Republicans who were really, at the time, who were really angry about that. And so, it was really like Stephen Miller's vile racism that threw a wrench in the immigration deal that was being worked out in Congress during the Trump years. So, and so I think that's really, really important. And Donald Trump, was fine to go along with whatever Stephen Miller, because it aligns with what he believes about immigrants and his vile beliefs about immigrants. But I think that's just really, really important for people to remember in terms of who's going to be running this country if Donald Trump returns to the White House.
So after Kamala Harris takes office, what's the first act that should happen? Should it be getting the Voting Rights Acts passed so all the rest of the agenda can take place?
So, okay, let's assume that Kamala Harris wins and Democrats keep both the House and the Senate, which is uncertain. But if we're talking about policy and that's the outcome, I think you have to. That's something. Let's entertain that hypothetical, because that's what I want to see happen.
Sure.
The first thing is that I think she'll probably focus on things that she can do through the reconciliation process. And just for context for your listeners, the reconciliation process is basically a budgetary process that was established in the Senate that allows you to pass items through a simple majority of 51 votes. And that was the process that was used for the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act. And how that basically works is that if you have a measure that can be justified as a budgetary item in terms of it either takes away revenues from the budget or brings in new revenues to the budget, it qualifies as a budgetary item. And basically who determines that is the Senate parliamentarian. So what I think, and what I hope she would do on reconciliation is make the child tax credit under the American Rescue Plan permanent, and which basically cut child poverty in half. And so that's something you can do, and it doesn't require. Yeah. So so I think there are, another thing that I think. So there are other things, but so doing as much social policy as she can through the tax code via the reconciliation process, I hope and I imagine will be a big priority of hers right when she's coming in.
Absolutely.
Now we have to think about. Now let's talk about the filibuster and filibuster reform.
Well,
there's a couple of ways.
we only have a couple of minutes. So
okay.
Make your last point on that.
So I'll make that very quickly.
Okay.
We can either have carve-outs filibuster on things like Roe, or we can establish a talking filibuster, or we can nuke the filibuster entirely. And that will depend on what Senate Democrats want to do.
Got it. And hopefully any or all of those things, I hope, will take place.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, this hour went really fast. I wish we had another hour to talk about all this stuff. But that's it for today's Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. I've been your host, Stephen Hanks, and I want to sincerely thank my guest, author and political commentator and analyst Mark McKibbin, for being here today. Mark, thanks so much for being on the show and all of your great thoughts, and keep up the great work that you're doing. And I can't wait to read your James Wilson book.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was such a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you so much for what you're doing. And Arizona is such an important state in this year, and whether it's the Senate, the presidency, or your ballot initiative on reproductive freedom. So it's an honor to be here and to talk to your listeners. That's great, and I hope to have you on again soon. And thanks to my sponsor. Absolutely. Yep. And thanks to my sponsor this week and next week, by the way, Aubrey Sonderegger, Democratic candidate for Coconino County Recorder, an extremely important position in this area of Arizona, as the recorder oversees how elections are run in the county,
part of which includes Sedona. I urge all Democrats, independents, and even some Republicans who want clean elections in Coconino County to vote for Aubrey Sonderegger. Many thanks to my producer in the booth, Ryan Thompson. And remember, you can live stream our show on mellowmountainradio.com and hear the podcast version on Apple and Amazon Podcasts, my YouTube channel, Spotify, and now my Substack newsletter at Patriotic Progressive. But for now, thanks for listening to the Patriotic Progressive for truth, justice, and the democratic way. Have a great week, everyone.